Good evening, everyone. We'll be beginning the session in about 2 minutes. I would just ask everybody to silence or turn off their cell phones at this time. Thank you. Good evening again. I'm Scott Buren, one of 2 project coordinators for the J. Sherwood McGinnis Jr. War, Peace, and Justice Project, and I welcome you to tonight's session titled Just War, Just Peace. This is a journey that we would like to share with you. This is just one way station on this journey. We began with our first session in August of this year, and we will, after tonight's session, tomorrow, we'll be replicating the same session at the Cumberland County Historical Society tomorrow evening from 7 to 9 p.m. And then after that, we're going to take a break over the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays and begin again in the new year to the spring of 2023. The purpose of the symposium is to illuminate the human drama of war and war's impact on society, specifically on our veterans and their families, but also on indigenous populations where conflict occurs. This is we know the toll, the heavy toll that war falls upon our servicemen and women, but also the indigenous populations. And we've also experienced the longest war in U.S. history, ending last year in Afghanistan at considerable cost, but also in Iraq, two theaters of war. And we know that over 7,000 U.S. servicemen were killed, over 55,000 servicemen and women who were wounded. Since 2004, some 78,000 veterans have committed suicide. We know that approximately, this is just an estimate, but over 350,000 indigenous innocent civilians in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan have been killed since the beginning of the conflict in 2001. So war has a heavy toll. It's a human phenomenon. And one of the other reasons for the symposium is to give everybody an understanding of the nature and also the consequences of war. And so what we are doing tonight is somewhat of a philosophical discussion, but what leads us into war, making those decisions and how we conduct war. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, Mark Matoza.
Thank you, Scott. So it's good to be with all of you tonight. I'm very happy to be here because my mother-in-law is a graduate of Dickinson College, so there's a real family connection here, as well as an importance with our discussion. So I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Evangelization with the Archdiocese for the Military Services, which is based in Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to serve as the facilitator for our gathering tonight. And I'd like to introduce our panelists first off. To my right is Dr. Jana Hunter-Bowman, who serves as the Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Christian Social Ethics. She's the Peace Studies Director at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. We also have Father Patrick Dolan, Chaplain Brigadier General retired, who holds a doctorate in chemistry and a doctorate in sacred theology. He served as the Army National Guard Assistant to the Chief of Chaplains and currently serves as pastor to 3 parishes in Casey County in the Archdiocese of Louisville, Kentucky. And also Dr. Eli McCarthy, who serves as the adjunct lecturer for the program on justice and peace at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's presently the Federal Policy Senior Advisor for the Catholic Labor Network and has worked with me as a co-leader for this panel discussion. So thank you for your collaboration. You'll be able to read the full biographies of the panelists on the War, Peace, and Justice Symposium website, warpeacejustice.org. And I want to thank all of you, the panelists, for your commitment to prepare and share insights this evening. There are three particular reasons that I have a vested interest in this topic. First, I grew up in a military family. My dad served in the United States Air Force for 26 years as a maintenance officer. And I recall being surrounded by many uniform patches and squadron emblems that had phrases such as ready power for peace, peace through strength, and keepers of the peace. Second, I work to support Catholic priests and coordinators in all branches of the military services who serve military personnel and their families. These are the people charged with the mission of defending the country who strive to fulfill their mission of faith, too. And finally, my wife and I are the proud parents of 3 children. One of our sons is in the Civil Air Patrol, and he's close to achieving his pilot license and aspires to fly for the military. So for those of us who are gathered this evening, whether our connection to the military is direct, by serving currently or having served, or by knowing someone who served, or even if our connection is indirect, the discussion this evening focuses on several key topics that at first glance may appear to be juxtaposed to one another. Just war and just peace propose various ways to keep the peace. While much has been written about just war theory, in fact, General Dubik spoke last evening about the importance of the strategic considerations when it comes to discerning just war, there has been a growing body of work that seeks just peace. George Washington noted that, quote, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace," end quote. Yet over time, we know that war and our capacity to wage war has changed dramatically. Those who have fought in war describe the sense of aloneness that can occur. Phil Clay, a recent veteran author, writes, quote, "The sense that I am alone, that no one can hear me, none can understand, that no one answers my cries. It is a sickness over which, to borrow from Bernanos, the vast tide of divine love, that sea of living, roaring flame which gave birth to all things, passes vainly," end quote. Bernanos was a French soldier who fought in World War I, and he was wounded several times. He's the author of Under Satan's Sun, which deals with the intense spiritual struggle in the face of humanity. Our panel has been exploring the just war tradition, which focuses on applying military power carefully to sustain relative goods in the face of greater evils. The panel has also been exploring the ethical framework of just peace, which focuses on developing skills to engage conflict constructively, to break cycles of violence, and to build a more sustainable just peace. Our hope is to stress that the international community must better understand and properly advocate regarding decision-making, the human costs and the moral consequences attached to the use of coercive and deadly force, especially the impact of war on civilian populations. This is necessary so security and liberty, as well as justice and peace, can prosper together. Our format this evening employs the symposium's interest in engaging dialogue through the humanities. So we will start by viewing about a 40-minute segment of the film Soldiers Without Guns. Afterwards, our 3 panelists will each provide a reflection related to just war, just peace. And finally, the floor will be open to engage in dialogue with one another. So we begin then with the film Soldiers Without Guns by Will Watson, which recounts a true story that contradicts the most basic assumptions about politics, foreign policy, and popular sociology. We'll learn about a small island north of Australia called Bougainville, named after a French explorer who claimed it in 1768. Germany claimed it in 1899. In World War I, Australia took it. In World War II, Japan took it. It returned to Australian domination after the war, but the Japanese had left piles of weapons behind. Over time, the people of Bougainville were made part of Papua New Guinea. The real point of contention in the 1960s, however, became a natural resource that found a dramatic rise in tension through the familiar pattern of violence until change came about through unexpected means. We now invite you to view a segment of Soldiers Without Guns. And I'll invite our panelists to take a seat so they can view as well.
Yeah, I've seen the whole thing.
So this whole documentary is a little over an hour, so I'm gonna share parts and then narrate the gaps and then bring us back to other parts of it, okay? But in total, it'll be about 40 minutes.
Bougainville is a Pacific Island paradise, 1,000 kilometers north of Australia. For thousands of years, its matrilineal Melanesian population lived in harmony with nature. Everyone agreed Bougainville was a paradise on earth. Then everything changed. During the 1960s, the world's largest deposits of copper were discovered on the island. In the 1980s, the mine became the genesis for the Pacific's worst civil war.
Bougainville is an island to the east of Papua New Guinea. Horrors have occurred there. 20,000 people killed, 1/6 of the population. And another 40,000 people are homeless. It is a secret war. It is an apocalyptic story of a ravaged people.
The conflict raged for 10 years. 14 peace attempts failed to stop the war. Human conflict is durable and spreads like wildfire. Peace is fragile and easily shattered, which makes ending conflict one of humanity's greatest challenges. In 1945, the United Nations was founded to stop war. It continues to struggle with ongoing conflicts. The first United Nations peacekeeping mission that began 60 years ago in the Middle East is still in operation. In Cyprus, 54 years on, the peacekeepers are still there, long after the world has forgotten why they went. In 2017, a global inability to create peace and stability drove the number of refugees to 65 million, the highest number since World War II. So, if the traditional models for peacekeeping have mostly failed, what could be done differently? To answer one of the world's most pressing questions, we will journey back to Bougainville. Here, 20 years ago, the guns fell silent, replaced by entirely different sounds. Why that happened is down to two things: radical new approaches to peacekeeping and some extraordinary women. From a place few have heard of, a story we should never forget.
So the story goes on to kind of explain how the the Civil War and the violence really started to scale up. And some of the locals tried to enter into negotiation with people who controlled the mine and perhaps get a percentage of the profits, but this offer was not accepted. So some started to sabotage the mine, and then the people who owned the mine connected with other countries that had soldiers, and soldiers came in, hundreds of civilians were killed, and then an armed resistance developed against the soldiers and the owners of the mine. So in 1988, about half of the mines ended up stopping, but Papua New Guinea, who had some soldiers in the area, still committed atrocities, which increased the violent resistance. And then, seemingly suddenly, in 1990, Papua New Guinea's soldiers left, and the people wondered if they had achieved victory. So we're going to pick it up there.
It was a very big jungle.
Suddenly left.
New Zealand have joined Papua New Guinea in refusing to recognise the Bougainville rebels' Declaration of Independence.
Although the Papua New Guinea army had left, the war was not over. Instead, they set up a naval blockade to starve the Bougainvilleans into submission. No one was allowed in or out of the island, including media, but some brave journalists did sneak past the blockade.
The blockade by PNG has had horrific results. Doctors here say at least 1,500 people have died from largely preventable diseases. That's only a conservative estimate, as the lack of communication means that there are no records kept outside the larger towns and villages.
With no international support and no government services, things quickly descended into anarchy and bloodshed.
The young men that were fighting felt that they won the war. They decided not to listen to the leadership. Young men with weapons, they would, go and demand goods from the trade store, broke into the banks. They started harassing people, raping women. They did not come from disciplined training force. It was a situation of anarchy and totally chaos. It made the people turn against BRA. People took sides. That made some of the people to go to Papua New Guinea and beg the security forces.
The northern Bougainvilleans, faced with chaos and a war they did not start, demanded that the Papua New Guinea Defence Force return. Seizing an opportunity to divide and conquer, the Defence Force arrived back on the island. They supplied the northern Bougainvilleans with arms and training to attack Sam Koona's rebel army down south. They also set up at strategic sites along the Bougainville coast and attacked inland to retake the mine. The Northern Bougainvillean army was generically called the Resistance. A full-scale triangular war broke out throughout the island. No one was safe, especially the women and children.
It was a bloody war. It is the bloodiest war.
It was a civil war that had been raging for almost 10 years. People were shot from and thrown out of helicopters. They were brother on brother.
It was a terrible war.
Anyone on their path would just be shot. And they didn't care about children. They didn't care about women. We separated. The children fled their own way, the mothers as well. So we were really scared.
There was a lot of atrocities and a lot of violations of human rights.
Artillery bombs were used to attack a church full of men, women, and children at a Sunday service. There was nowhere to hide.
that brought a lot of suffering on the women and children, especially because they become the victims of war.
It was silent war, particularly women, being raped while their families watched. It was inhuman for men to do that to women. I was so scared of being raped, losing my husband as well.
So the naval blockade continued, and they soon did not have enough clothing for the cold winter. Kids were dying, so many of the women started to smuggle in medicine and tried to strengthen some of the local bonds. Papua New Guinea at the time was starting to plan a larger war, and they got a mercenary army from the UK. The Papua New Guinea general suddenly was against this approach by the leader of Papua New Guinea, so chaos kind of developed in Papua New Guinea, and the leader eventually stepped down, and Australia kind of came back in and decided to try something different. And this is when New Zealand gets involved.
The Bougainville decided to take a first-hand look at the situation.
It was a shock. It was devastating. This is in our own region. To see people creeping out of the bush, who clearly had not been fed for some time, who were really quite desperate. I said, look, we're going to start breaking some ice here and doing some things differently.
New Zealand was uniquely placed to do this, and Australia could not have done it. Australia stood for the sovereignty of Papua New Guinea, have been providing military hardware for the Papua New Guinea Defence Force. And of course, one of the origins of the crisis, the mine at Panguna, was an Australian mine.
The United Nations wasn't particularly energised on the Bougainville conflict. They thought they had other issues to deal with. And in came New Zealand, much more of a clean skin in this issue than Australia was.
New Zealand is seen to be an honest broker in these matters by many of the Pacific Island.
Well, I wanted to really let them know in a very personal way that we really wanted to effect an end to the civil war.
Big changes were afoot in Papua New Guinea. Bill Skate was now the new leader of the country. He demanded fresh perspectives, and together with Australia, they welcomed New Zealand into the fray.
So, look, if we really want to make some progress, let's get them all off the island. Let's get them into neutral territory somewhere.
Don McKinnon directed New Zealand diplomat John Hayes to round up the delegates throughout the island and bring them to New Zealand for pan-Bougainville peace talks. This would be a very dangerous job. The war was still going on, and any planes or helicopters were still being shot down. Could he persuade enemies, people who had spent a decade trying to kill each other, to come out of the jungle and get into the same helicopter?
Typical of John. He's just sort of a man, whether there's a danger, no danger, he'll just bulldoze his way through. We were following him on the radio, two-way radio. He picked up the first two delegates.
He then headed to the Panguna mine area, where he would be most at risk.
highlight the thing saying that we've been shot. What has happened now could be the end for any future hope, future chance, future opportunity for Bougainville.
John Hayes' bullet-ridden helicopter was forced to make an emergency landing. This was going to end the 15th peace attempt.
I knew deep down in my heart that it is now going to depend on how New Zealand government was going to react on that incident. The future of Bougainville was really in the hands of the New Zealanders.
Hayes never reported that he'd been shot down. Instead, he radioed that the helicopter had had a mechanical failure.
Describing the incident as a mechanical failure, that usage of word mechanical failure, it showed to me that I think there is hope. When the whole peace attempt could have just evaporated like, smoke into the sky, they played a tremendous role right from the heart.
Miraculously, all 50 delegates arrived safely in New Zealand for peace talks. This was the first time women were included, and the first time anyone had experienced winter. Aotearoa, New Zealand, was the appropriate place for the Bougainvilleans as they found an immediate kinship with the indigenous Maori people. Together, they share many of the same values, including a close connection with the land.
There was so much respect for culture. That really sent a real strong message, because to get rid of the Panguna mine was really to protect the culture.
Before the Bougainvilleans arrived, the New Zealand Army had undergone a process of transformation. Maori culture was now formally integrated into everyday military routine. The integration became known as the Ngāti Tūmatoenga, or more commonly known as Ngāti Tū.
This concept of Ngāti Tū, about bringing cultures together, about recognising the values of each and not contradicting you, but saying, here are the strengths. Let's bring them together. Let's fuse this whole new kaupapa. Warfighter is about bringing strangers together in a Māori way. And that is by having a challenge. You send out a warrior, or two, or three. And you say to them, hang on, we're not too sure who you are. Then you offer them a token to say, if you pick this up, you're saying to me, you're coming in peace. And then out goes the karanga from our woman to welcome them, to pull them onto the marae. And in the touching of noses, or it's called the hongi, the sharing of the ha, or the breath, you are able then to feel of each other.
Was a very human way of transmitting the the breath of peace into each other.
They were asking us, why are you embracing one another? Why are you crying?
And I've seen it where nose is touched, breath is shared, tears drop.
Only 24 hours earlier, these people were at war. And now they were sitting side by side, freezing cold.
We all gathered around and we stood, we waited, and then we saw these New Zealanders performing haka.
Kamate, kamate, kora! Kamate, kamate, kora!
The word haka, the ha and the ka. See, the ha is about the explosion of the breath. And the ka is about the entire ihi, the wihi, the energy, the life force that you generate in pushing out the ha.
You know, when we saw both the Pakias and the Maoris, you know, together, you know, performing the act, working together, blending, you know, into one another. They're really respecting the indigenous people of New Zealand.
The ha and the ka combined to set out such a powerful, spiritual, emotional message that it goes whack, it connects. And you don't have to understand one word of what's being said.
That actual ceremony, I would say, gave us that desire and warmth to go and shake our hands of our brothers and sisters on the other side.
People that hadn't talked to each other for 10 years and were really looking at each other across the barrel of a gun and have now become very close friends.
We have affirmed in the Bellum Declaration that there is no longer justification for war and violence.
It calls for unity and reconciliation, the declaration of a ceasefire, a neutral peacekeeping force, and the demilitarization of Bougainville.
It succeeded because New Zealand said, we will not interfere. We will not interfere with you. We are just bringing you here. You have your talks, you do whatever you want. You have it here.
Many of us who went, when we came back, we prepared our people and we told them that the time will come when we will, you know, there will be people coming to keep peace so that we can sort ourselves out.
The New Zealand-led peace process had brokered a truce, but not all factions were in agreement.
Francis Honor, he was already accusing us, who were in the peace process, saying that we'll be collaborating with the New Zealanders to wipe out Francis Honor and Holy supporters.
New Zealand Brigadier Roger Mortlock was placed in command of the peacekeeping mission. How was he going to deal with all the divided factions in Bougainville? He had previous experience of jungle warfare in Vietnam, then as a peacekeeping commander for the United Nations in the city of Wombo, Angola.
And I guess a lot of people like me say, well, we went to Vietnam and we learned how to lose a war. I took that very much to heart. In my middle years as a colonel, I was sent to the United Nations mission in Angola. And I figure I learned how to lose a peace. When I withdrew my command through the outskirts of the city of Wombo, where I had my headquarters, one old lady shouted something out. She said, and now the suffering will begin again. That little incident was tattooed on my brain. I was having difficulty keeping a dry eye, and I had this heavy, intolerable sense of having failed. If you're going to intervene, you have to succeed.
An anxious public wanted to know why their small country, New Zealand, would be getting involved in a hidden war with a history of 14 failed peace attempts. Unfortunately, Mortlock's words were not going to calm the anxiety.
I believe that this is a mission that is really worth doing. I got asked quite directly what our tactics were, what weapons we would be taking. And I wasn't being flippant at the time, but I did have a point to make. The Maori concert group and a good shipment of guitars are going to be the main weapons in our arsenal.
What's he on about? Guitars and no weapons? Who, as a commander, would say to his contingent, we're taking guitars and not rifles? Who in their right mind would put that up there? You've really got to be thinking, I should be in the funny farm.
So Roger's plan was to take in a force which had within it women, a god element, was unarmed, and that was going to sing 10 guitars and basically go to the communities that it needed to work in and go in unarmed, and that was unheard of.
I remember we had a National Security Committee of our cabinet to discuss it. And our first thought was, you know, my instinct was that maybe they should be armed. After all, there are armed people out there in Bougainville on both sides.
I ended up lampooned in the major newspapers next day.
Already we were scared of people with guns, no? So by bringing in people that did not have guns, that kind of approach was very important for the people of Bougainville.
Guns brought fear, shame, killing, destroyed whole clans, destroyed families, divided people. We didn't trust each other because we were killed by our own people.
New Zealand would lead the Truce Monitoring Group, now called the TMG. Understanding the importance of culture and language, Mortlock included the surrounding Melanesian nations of Vanuatu and Fiji. The operation would be called Bellisi, which means at ease in Pidgin, the local language of Bougainville. Francis Honour and some factions were unhappy with the Truce Monitoring Group's setup, which included Australians who were distrusted by the Bougainvillians. Also, it did not have a time frame for creating an independent Bougainville.
Without independence, we are looking at more bloodshed. We are looking at more destruction of Bougainville.
I told President Francis Honour, then I said, look, I think it is wise for us to listen to what the people are saying. Unfortunately, that's where we differed. The fact that Francis Honour was still out there in the jungles. He had the arms. If peacekeepers came in armed, fully armed, it could have needed a small thing, a small incident to get the whole war back on the road again.
An unarmed force was the most appropriate, given that we're asking everyone else to put down their arms on the armed at the same time.
Much of the media questioned Mortlock's tactics. He continued to calmly diffuse all doubters, but secretly, This radical operation was under huge pressure.
What we read about here is, of course, the chaos and the small factions of armed, maniacs.
I'm surprised so much has been made of this.
So it's no big deal.
It's no big deal.
Would it be fair to say a sense of excitement amongst those going at the moment, a sense of anticipation?
Well, I know I'm excited.
Before arriving on the island, Papua...
So as they prepared to go, they got on the flight and they were at serious risk of being shot down as they kind of entered into the very small airport. But it became a situation where the locals that they had met became critically important, if not responsible, to also protect them, to protect the soldiers coming from New Zealand, to vouch for them.
Protect the peacekeepers. Suspicious.
When the New Zealanders came on the ground, it was now up to those who had that experience of having been to New Zealand to explain to the rest of the people. So no, I think we can work. We can trust these people who are coming.
The governments of New Zealand and Australia in particular have been very impressed with the determination and the actions of the people of Bougainville towards reconciliation and peace.
They are a cultural people. They have their own way of doing culture, and they welcome the fact that the culture that was coming to them wasn't a Western culture.
Brigadier Mortlock connected to the people by speaking Maori, English, and the local language of Bougainville, Pidgin.
Roger gave this beautiful story of a river. He said, when river starts up in the mountains, it flows. As it flows down the mountainside through lowlands, the river comes across. Sometimes huge boulders will come across the path of the river flow. But the river doesn't stop there. It will find a way, a different direction, and the river will flow. Sometimes it will split into 2 or 3, but still the river flows. Not yet coming with pens and papers.
haka sort of become something that was anticipated. If you didn't do it, there was dramatic disappointment, so you sort of had to do it.
That was really good having women amongst the men, because these women were role models. These women went out into the communities.
The reason that the women were able to have such an influence in Bougainville is because they were dealing with women. Women wanted to talk to women. Part of the planning of who would go to Bougainville, they knew that they needed to take two squads. They needed to take a women's squad to talk and work with women, and they needed to take a God squad because these people believed in Christianity. You would go to a church area and the women would all be talking about the things that they could do and what would actually bring around peace in the area. And they actually led the charge because they're mothers. And they now, through having the TMG there and then subsequent forces, were able to travel, to actually group together, to come up with plans about how they would bring about peace.
They flew us to central Bougainville, and we talked with the women there, say, what you are feeling here are felt by women in North Bougainville as well. So we shouldn't be enemies. We should be talking together. We should influence our men.
When they came with music and aroha in their heart, it instilled in us and woken up this peace that was destroyed by the war.
Aroha has been taken literally to mean love. Aroha is about this ability to be able to share, to give. It incorporates things like love, giving, and forgiving, all into this arena called aroha. Tētahi ki tētahi, aroha for each other.
So the story about the river was that it was an analogy for
In
the
the Middle
peace.
East, 3 months about to drop.
Sorry, that it was an analogy for the peace process.
We had to give it away to the Australians.
Bougainville culture has a unique reconciliation ceremony called breaking bows and arrows, which provides a way for enemies to forgive each other. Everyone from army generals to mothers engage in reconciliation.
There were members that were killed by our force. My men did it. And there were hate between the families that was existing in my area here.
Usually, the victim initiates reconciliation because there is half business there. Something is wrong.
I did not actually put my hand on them, but because of my position as a general, I have to initiate that, go through the process. We have to come together, talk about it, and initially, I have to pay compensation to them, involving traditional gifts.
And through the humility of the victim, it melts the hearts of the perpetrators. So then they reconcile. They learn how to love and to have compassion for others and how to look after others and how to forgive others, because human beings are only mistake makers. The only real mistake is the one we learn nothing from.
We have to reconcile. If we are to exist live happily in this part of the world.
Since the peace accord was signed, the spark that ignited
So this is kind of the end of what we're going to share this evening. There was a truce that led to a peace accord in the next 3 months. New Zealand actually ran out of funds at one point, and they were going to hand it over to Australia, and this created some tensions, and a local leader was actually killed. So they had to go back into the bush to get the delegates to sign the accord, but it was these locals who were able to vouch and kind of activate this credibility that ultimately led to these rituals of reconciliation. So now we're going to turn to some reflections.
Move the tables just a little bit more to the center. Here we go. That's good.
So thank you, Eli, for bringing us through that film. There's so much to unpack there, and I think when we think of them going to New Zealand and being brought together by the cold, we can identify a little bit with that this evening. And I'm glad we have our panelists who can bring some warmth to this discussion and help unpack a little bit about some of these experiences. So I invite Dr. Jana Bowman-Hunter.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Scott and to Mark and to Eli. I don't know, is the mic on? Okay, very good. So my participation in this kind of theme and my presentation this evening in particular grows out of my own frustration as a human rights defender and someone who was working in peace building in war-torn Colombia, South America. And I was working in a framework and working towards a just peace. And this frustration was that the rights-based framework of peace building that I was using was unable to detect the agency and the activity of war victims on the ground there. And so the particular, the experience that I bring is connecting and bringing forward this idea of the work of the communities on the ground that were really instrumental in activating and continuing to move along a process that ultimately led to the kinds of transformation that Eli was indicating and that we saw at the end of the film. Because what I saw there is that civilians were self-protecting and contributing to efforts of transformation. But it seemed to me that my interlocutors at the US Embassy and the military personnel with whom I regularly interacted did not have a good sense of what these war-affected civilians were doing and how they could contribute to a more just peace. So I argue that when the dominant option for diagnosing activity in a war zone or a conflict zone like we see here is focused on the individual autonomy of the rights-constituted subject, we need another approach for thinking about the agency of protection and peace building amid constraints on autonomy. So like in situations of armed conflict, but not only limited to situations of armed conflict. So as we saw here, it was hard to see what it was that these unarmed civilians on the ground could do and were doing when what you saw was all of the fighting, right? And all of the ways in which fighting was producing victims. So when persons enact change amid high levels of constraint, injustice, and direct violence endemic to situations of armed conflict, they participate in what might be called constructive agency under duress. This agency under duress, which is crucial to peace building, decenters state institutions and lifts up grassroots participation. But it's escaped the notice of those adhering to the dominant framework for evaluating armed conflict. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you with me to Colombia to show you what I mean, with the goal of shining a light on these grassroots communities building peace from the ground up. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do this in this space because oftentimes external interventions, including military interventions, but not only military interventions, undermine these kinds of fragile processes that are so important. Along the way, I'm going to continue to unpack some of the limitations of a liberal human rights lens for recognizing and respecting these actors. And then I'm going to close by noting what might be some surprising points of contact between these agents under duress and military personnel. So this is August 5th, 2009, in Northwest Colombia in the Department of Córdoba. Dozens of unarmed women and men suddenly leave their fields, vegetable stands, and workshops in order to protect Isaac, a civilian wanted by paramilitary armed group soldiers. The state army is within easy walking distance of the impending assassination, but soldiers don't respond to urgent calls for help. Those who call are told that the army would not be able to arrive until 4 p.m. the next day. According to the community, the army and paramilitary collusion is the secret that everybody knows. Such conditions of oppression and immediacy of death in Colombia led anthropologist Michael Tausung to write about a space of death that transforms while maintaining its hallucinatory quality. But oppression is not totalizing, and terror tactics do not always have the desired effect. Church members quickly gather in supplication at the slat-walled church where Isaac had sought refuge. Isaac is in their midst, held by the community that is interceding and, according to them, intervening with God on his behalf. They remain and protect him throughout the night, then smuggle him out in the pre-dawn shadows under the watchful eye of the paramilitary. That's the short version of the story. Amid extreme political tensions in an embattled area abandoned by the state, the community neutralized and counteracted violence through their corporate practice of agency. Through their participation, they transformed a space of terror with a firm grip on the nearly dead into one of relative peace. The next day, after several tries, I got through to the regional authorities to follow up, which was my job as someone who is coordinating a national human rights project, co-coordinating this national human rights project. The woman on the other end of the line says that no one filed a report about an attempted assassination and that it would be impossible to register a complaint now, and she hangs up on me. According to authorized knowledge and official rubrics, therefore, nothing happened. This civilian state bureaucrat is helping to paint a veneer of denial over this violence. How people in marginalized war zones survive is not information that counts. There's no way to speak of what the community has done to neutralize, torment, relieve pain, risk everything to protect and heal in that moment. So what I want to highlight from Isaac's case is this. The community claimed their entitlements, their rights, and they alerted the appropriate channels in an effort to trigger an official response in an impending assassination. One might expect a call to the police and the military to trigger a response and then an arrest of a criminal element. This is because the state is supposedly the guarantor of these rights. Yet the arm of the government mandated to protect the civilian population betrayed its constituents in this particular case, as it often did, and no institutional body or representative intervened to safeguard Isaac's rights. In this instance, the promise of rights remained unfulfilled. Rights-based mechanisms were, and therefore, insufficient for achieving the aspiration of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I quote, that all beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, they're endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. These Colombian civilians did not abdicate their claims to rights, but in order to protect their friend, they knew they would have to engage actively in something else entirely. The story demonstrates that the generative intervention affected communities these communities can achieve the aims of rights, commitments, and discourse, but they're doing so under circumstances that rights discourse are inadequate to describe. By this, I don't intend to conflate the problem of negligent officials with the limitations of right discourse. Rather, I want to pinpoint a moment in time in which people long for the promise of rights, the protection of life and limb, proclaimed worldwide in the aftermath of the Second World War, They long for this to be realized. But at that point, rights mechanisms existed theoretically. But in this case, Isaac was not protected from pain and death precisely because the state didn't act as required by international human rights law. Nor could the rights framework detect or explain what happened next. The vulnerable local population moved into the vacuum to protect Isaac. He believes they protected him from becoming a homicide statistic in the many rights reports diagnosing the war zone he calls home. What was significant in cases like Isaac's at the grassroots level, this kind of level that we're never even going to hear about, what was life-saving for him completely eluded modern rights discourse, the language that's spoken by states and international institutions at 30,000 feet, which is, of course, an incredibly important discourse. Providing protection is an exercise of constructive agency under duress. The communities redressed an instance of injustice in a situation of crisis, meeting the goal of rights even though rights were not in place. The liberal piece assumes that human rights are necessary to save life and limb, but the community's constructive intervention realized the goal when rights regimes were unsuccessful. They failed to understand so then this lens fails to understand crucial engagement by agents under duress because they assume that the goal of rights can only be reached if a minimal threshold of autonomy is met. Moreover, since those enmeshed in situations of injustice do not enjoy the conditions necessary to free agency, rights frameworks seem to assume that they are not agents at all. Since agency under duress is outside the scope of rights-based evaluation, which is shaped by negative prohibitions that protect the conditions of free agency, rights-based theories neither pretend nor aspire to capture them. Nevertheless, failure to attend to this kind of agency forfeits opportunities for transformative peace building. So we need to find other ways of attending to this agency. We find other ways of talking about it. So this notion of constructive that I'm using here is linked to how I understand the term duress and its place in Catholic moral theology, where it refers to constraints on autonomy that might lead someone to cooperate with evil acts that she would have extricated herself from were it not from forced choices. But it's an extension, however, in that I'm not talking about how people have been forced into entanglements with evil, but rather about what have people been able to accomplish under duress. The collective agency is constructive because the kind of high-risk interventions didn't end in this moment that created the conditions of a negative peace or the absence of direct violence amidst war, or what in this moment of protection. The intervention generated further change. Communities became models of community-based nonviolent de-escalation and healing that altered conflict dynamics and indicated the direction of the social processes that they initiated. They became reference points for community-based protection and held what they called pastoral dialogues to help civilians deal with the warring armed groups in their region. At first, they were ignored by people in positions of power in Bogotá, the capital of Colombia. They traveled at great personal cost to propose concrete collaborative efforts to transform violence, and they were met with humiliating condescension by representatives of the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace of the Government of Colombia, who told them that what they were doing was not actually peace building. Years later, these very same politicians would ask them for help after these leaders grew in public recognition and when it was no longer convenient to ignore them. They were called on regionally and eventually on a national level, leveraged to help prepare the ground for and implement the 2016 peace agreement between the national government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the longest-running guerrilla group in Latin America, better known by the acronym FARC. Mm-hmm. One community was awarded the Premio Nacional de Paz, a leading peace prize in Colombia. Others catalyzed the nationally renowned peaceful process of reconciliation and integration of the Alta Montaña, which is featured a number of times in national news magazines. When the government of Colombia was seeking international support to negotiate peace with the FARC, they uplifted these very same communities, suggesting, as they did in a talk at Harvard, if these communities can transition from war to peace in the midst of internal armed conflict, then surely we, the government, can do it so as well. So they're actually leveraging the moral power of these tiny, insignificant communities to justify and to try to persuade others that they also could play a role. It was pretty amazing for me. Since the 2016 peace accord between the government of Colombia and FARC, these communities have been actively engaged in implementing peace through identifying points of contact between their ongoing efforts, now which have been ongoing for decades in some cases. So points of contact between their ongoing efforts and the stipulations of the peace agreement, or the commitments of the peace agreement, of which there are more than 500. So we can call this issue linking. It's based on so the communities identify, okay, what are our felt needs and our goals, and with the ongoing processes that emerge from them, and then find the commitments in the agreement, and the Peace Accord matrix at the University of Notre Dame has digested the whole agreement. So it's now in an Excel document, and we can very easily search it in order to locate these points of contact, or something that we've been doing with a number of communities. So connecting, so to do this kind of, we call issue linking. And this is a way of very practically linking grassroots, mid-level, and then government or elite level actors in peace building, which is an important part of the just peace approach that Eli will be talking about. We're seeing how this collaboration can bring together the different forms of expertise, the different kinds of power that these actors all rely upon, which I think is an interesting point of contact here too, to notice how different kinds of people are bringing different ideas about different forms of power and different kinds of expertise and ways of thinking about approaches that might work. So the question is here, how do we leverage these together? And so this kind of work then also gestures towards a form of robust participatory democracy and institution building that I find really exciting, but that is another talk. I want to close by noting one reason I find this symposium that thinks about engaging civilian-military dialogue intriguing, especially in view of this work that I've been talking about with you on agents under duress, who are relying on power of nonviolence to provide protection in situations of an open armed conflict. According to some of the research that I've read, this research shows what I think many of us have observed, and that is that some military cultures differs in respects from civilian cultures with respect to some values and practices and meanings within these different cultures. In view of the dichotomy that some researchers discuss, dialogues like this one are extremely valuable. Some researchers suggest, and this is particularly looking at some older research, so maybe this isn't this isn't the latest, but Bortz and Wilson talk about that part of the heart of this dichotomy that often exists between civilian and military cultures is the fact that military personnel are trained to break, and sometimes do break in real life, the civilian taboo against killing and the moral imperative not to kill. And I think this is a part of what this question of moral injury is about. So I'm not offering any kind of solution to deal with this dichotomy, but maybe a bridge, and for me that's something that's interesting to think about, is that the military and the communities under duress that I've been describing have in common a willingness to risk and sacrifice to protect others. Mm-hmm. The persons that I work with will not kill, but they do place themselves on that edge of life and death in their willingness to die for others again and again. They've demonstrated it, and I've seen it, and they've done it for me. Tragically, some of them have been killed along the way. Many become agents through acting together in high-risk situations. They become agents under duress together and accomplish something together that they could not have achieved alone. I mentioned this as another possible bridge to help us appreciate civilians' contributions to protection and to a just peace. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really helpful for us to kind of think about what we just saw and then put it in another context, and considering these linkings and that desire for this longing for peace. And I think it helps us now create a bridge towards just war. So, Father Dolan, we turn to you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking the time out this evening to come and listen and hopefully ask questions and discuss. I'm going to go back to the film a little bit and unpack it for you just to kind of add some clarity, kind of how the problem developed and then how the solution developed, because there are a couple of pieces that were left out that I consider very critical. The big thing is that Bougainville was doing pretty well until they discovered copper, okay? A lot of copper, and it was needed. It was mined without respect to the culture. That respect is critical, and it was a destruction of the culture in the process of doing that. There was then an unfair sharing of resources because Papua New Guinea, once it took over the thing, that was half of their national income. That was a big percentage of what kept their government going. And they were reluctant to share that kind of thing in various ways. Once there were problems then, Papa pulled back all civilian resources, banks, protection, police, hospitals. And they actually blockaded people. They didn't stop them from eating because, it's a jungle. You can grow just about anything there. But they took away all the civilized services, all the medicines and things that were necessary to there. As a result, the people returned into barbarism and fought each other because they had different ways of looking at the thing. Now, because of that, that's one of the ways of divide and conquer. You let people have so much trouble that they're willing to accept almost anything to get out of that. And part of what happened is that you had survival instincts, and you had a lot of mistrust, and you had weapons left over from the Japanese that were still functional. Solution. What happened was the women particularly were tired of the conflict. It had gone on so long, they saw only bad results, that they wanted to do just about anything they could to reconcile and stop themselves from fighting against each other. The same thing happened in Sri Lanka around the same time period. There was the Tamil Tigers and others, and it was the women who, after years of violence, started reconciling with each other. Same kind of thing is here. So there were 4 points of problems. There was a destruction of culture, unfair sharing, removal of civilized services that kind of returned people to a survival state with mistrust, and you had weapons to do it. The solution had 4 parts to it as well. They were tired of the conflict, and they were willing to take risks to stop that conflict, which was only making life worse for their children. So you went back to even basic instincts to try and take whatever efforts there were there. Second thing is, they were connecting with an honest broker, New Zealand, who wasn't part of the mining or anything like that, and they connected culture to culture. That Maori culture that they were doing without weaponry, but also appealed almost to an instinctive flavor in the Bougainvilleans because they were close in cultural things that were able to do that. You saw the same thing on Christmas of 1914, World War I. People stopped fighting. They hadn't gotten into too many of the trenches yet. They came out singing. There was a culture that they connected. Unfortunately, the leaders did not want to exploit that and started the war again the next day. Okay. Second thing was, because of the cultural thing, there was something they didn't mention, is they granted official amnesty to everyone who was fighting. That is critical because they had the legal process to know that no matter what you had done, you would not be put in jail. Otherwise, there was no reason to throw down your arms. And then there was a top-to-bottom reconciliation. You saw them bringing in the top leaders once the women had pushed those leaders to actually cooperate and be given a chance, and they were connected culturally, again, with an honest broker, the Maori kind of flavor. So it was a culture being welcomed by another culture and given a chance then to start to reason together. That was the top part. Then they went back in to all the different parts, and that's where some of the peacekeepers came in without weapons. Really good thing. Because, as they said, if they're going to ask people to get rid of their weapons, they had to show that they were willing to do so as well. They connected with two things. One was going out to each little group, playing with kids, things like that, showing that they were there only to help. Secondly, they connected with music. Music cross cultures in various ways. Even, for example, the Japanese start out their New Year celebrations with Beethoven, the Ninth Symphony and things like that. It's not a Japanese melody, but it's good music and stuff. The result, sadly, though, is that the mine is still closed. The copper's not doing anybody any good. They've got an autonomous region slowly developing its own identity, and that could have been done from the very beginning. And there would have even been more profits for the people who had wanted to get the copper and every place else. They didn't have to degenerate into that conflict. So, now where does this kind of leave us? Because I'm a soldier without weapons, or without guns. I do have other weapons. I use holy water, other kind of things. And I can tell you stories about how we stopped some of the ghosts in Kuwait in 2005 from attacking our soldiers and holding them underwater, moving things against them and stuff. And it's been reported, it's actually filed in the Archdiocese of Military Service. But I do have weapons, but it's not guns. And there are things that we can do. So what can we do? And what you need is those same kinds of solutions. You have to be able to have people that are tired of it, connecting with one another, and an honest broker, and a culture of respect and welcome. Even if it's not your culture, you can respect it and give a sense of dignity and worth. You have to have official amnesty to be able to give people a framework from the outside so that they can do that. And finally, there has to be a top and bottom type of reconciliation. But the big thing I'd suggest is that we don't have to degenerate into that. We could have found ways of respecting the culture from the very, very beginning and still mine the copper. I'm a chemist. I worked with copper. I like it, that kind of thing, stuff like that. But you don't have to destroy a culture in the process of doing that. You don't have to disrespect them and make it work. So, subject to any of your questions afterwards, I'll be happy to develop these ideas further. Mark?
Father, thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Could I, Father, ask you just, because your expertise is in just war,
yes,
maybe just say a few things, how just war might relate to this conversation or what we've experienced in the film. You articulated very well what we saw.
What was going on,
and
okay.
the chaos, and what would just war maybe have to say?
Well, just war developed very differently, particularly in a Christian context. It developed under the Roman Empire, where the Christians at first had no influence. But there were a lot of them in the Roman legions. Much like National Guard duty. They took care of disasters and things like that, but they also protected the borders. So there were these 7 criteria that developed, 2 of them right there. If you had to go in battle, you had to have a just authority emperor, whether or not you liked the emperor. The second thing is you had to do it with good conscience. You didn't want to go in and just do bloodlust. You weren't in the arena fighting as gladiators. When the empire fell, then they developed that you had to have a just cause. So if you had one petty noble wanting to attack another, they had to have a really good reason that was transparent. Otherwise, it was just stealing, basically, stealing someone's land and things. Then you also had to have discrimination. They had the peace of God and the truce of God, where they protected hearth and home, and they also protected the agencies that would be able to bring about a safe peace. You didn't want to wipe out monasteries because they were the only ones who could read and write and draft your peace treaty and things like that. You didn't wipe out the church, God would get you. You didn't attack a nun, oh, don't even think about it. I went to grade school. So there's this discrimination that was in there, that you only fought one another because it was a dishonorable thing, and the whole rest of the community would rise against you if you did. Much like what you were talking about, the local community was the ones who protected against the assassination. So, and the people out in the jungle were not going to attack the entire community. They knew that their parents would get all over them and things like that. You know, so there's some things that you reach back into, kind of a human instinct to help foster what is right to do against the human temptations of just violence. So you had good intentions, you had just cause, you had discrimination. The last three came a little bit later. Proportionality is something that came mainly in the 1600s. You were kind of involved with merchants' nations. The Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish had colonies and stuff. If you had to fight against someone, was it worth it? Were you going to lose more than you were going to gain by trying to initiate some kind of conflict? The other issue that applies to people without weapons and those with them, if a commander is going to send someone in to do something and risk their lives, that commander has to have a proportionately good reason to do it. If all it's going to do is create more chaos, then the intervention is not moral. If it's going to do some good, or at least has a realistic hope of doing that, and that's the next thing. You had to have a realistic hope of success, or you're just going to make the matters more bloody. Now, what is realistic? Anyone looking objectively at the American Revolution would not have said that we had a realistic hope of success. Looking at from the kind of the intuition of the people involved. How many of you ever seen the musical 1776? Okay, it's moving, powerfully moving. I mean, it brings you to tears. The conviction that they had that this was right to do gave them that reasonable hope for success. And it did succeed. The British at that time said this just isn't profitable anymore, a proportionality thing, and went into further taxation and things like that afterwards and stuff. The final thing is that war became a last resort only in the 1900s. Bismarck used war as a tool in the 1870s. It was only push for how bad the weaponry and the horrors of war had gotten that people made it just an absolute last resort. Those are their criteria there. Now, how did they apply to this? Because they would apply to how the problem was created more than to the solution. The solution to all of these boils down to one word: respect. If you have respect for one another, you will give them their rights and expect rights from them in return, and humans will do that. If you have the respect for the culture, equal sharing of justice and things like that, then the criteria for going to war are not there. But you do have to have enough of a secure framework that these things can be looked at safely. You have to at least have people being willing, that, like they went in with the helicopters and pulled out the leaders. There are people being willing to come to a safe enough place to do it where they knew they would not be attacked in the process. So that's the just war criteria do not apply well to this one. They would have applied 10 years earlier and things like that. But in terms of healing, the just war criteria are not there. They're kind of to stop you from getting into the problem in the first place. And that was the issue from which they were developed over the course of almost 2,000 years. Okay, thank you. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that framework to think about, because it's helpful to have that in context as we think about another framework, which is just peace.
Yes.
And we're lucky to have Dr. Eli McCarthy to help walk us through that.
Step up here. I have a few slides.
Yeah. Death by PowerPoint. Yeah.
All right, so this is the last piece here, and then we'll open it up for your insights and discussion and so forth. I'm just going to do two basic things, just kind of introduce this just peace framework, and then reflect a little bit on what kind of implications might it have for the military institution. So hopefully you'll be willing to think with me on that. So the just peace moral framework arises from and within what you might call a pastoral approach. That is, that listens to the experiences and voices of people in conflict situations across various cultural spaces. So this orientation kind of envisions just peace as a way of cooperation for the common good, care for our ecological home, the prevention of violence, and a focus on trying to transform conflict by taking a close look at the root causes and promoting nonviolent approaches. Let me pull this up here. There's 3 basic categories here, and you see those kind of outlined on your one-pager. The first one is develop virtues and skills for engaging conflict constructively. Second, breaking cycles of violence. And third, building more sustainable peace. And the idea is that these can overlap in time and space. They apply to all stages of conflict. And that the strategies or the actions that are chosen must enhance or at least not obstruct any of these norms that we'll walk through in a moment, as well as this attempt to keep the means and ends consistent as possible. So the first category, virtues and skills to transform conflict. So these are the norms within that one. Number 1, virtuous habits. So virtues like courage and justice and compassion. Number 2, education and training in key skills, such as nonviolent communication, civil resistance, social analysis of root causes, gender or racial needs-based analysis. Number 3, participatory processes, including key stakeholders, particularly women and young people. 4, forming nonviolent peacemaking communities, institutions, and cultures. Second category, breaking dynamics or cycles of violence. So here, reflexivity is a critical norm, which is keeping the means and ends consistent. Rehumanization, the kind of language we use to describe others, particularly maybe the adversary, the narratives that we focus on to tell the story of what we think is going on. Conflict transformation, so addressing root causes, and this can include practices like dialogue, trauma healing, independent initiatives to build trust. Number 3, acknowledge responsibility for harm. And this is where things like restorative justice can come into play. Number 4, nonviolent direct action. So your civil, your nonviolent resistance movements, unarmed civilian protection. We saw a video earlier about that. Nonviolent civilian-based defense, we'll come back to. And then integral disarmament. So this is a term that kind of refers to the connection between sort of the bitterness and the hatred that might be in our hearts and the physical weapons that we have made and distributed around the world. So if we want to really reduce the presence of physical harmful weapons, we also need to reduce the bitterness and the hatred, hostility in our own hearts. So it is an integral disarmament process. And the last category, first norm here is relationality and reconciliation. So building relations across diverse groups and sectors. It could be interreligious dialogue, truth and reconciliation commissions, like they have in Colombia. Number 2, robust civil society and just governance. So the redistribution of political power and the practice of advocacy. Number 3, ecological sustainability. Number 4, human dignity and human rights of all, including the adversaries. And economic, gender, and racial justice with the focus on the marginalized and the vulnerable. So that is a short summary. There's a book called The Just Peace Ethic Primer if you want to take a deeper dive, and there's a whole bunch of cases, international and US cases, that kind of work with that framework. So just a couple comments, kind of some comparisons between just peace and just war. And there's a lot more than this, but just to kind of open it up, and then we'll go into the last part. So on the one hand, just peace helps us to address root causes of conflicts and build a more sustainable peace. Whereas the just war framework tends not to have that focus on root causes of violence and kind of building a more sustainable peace. Second, the just peace, with this attention to virtues and cultivating skills, it better forms us as courageous, nonviolent peacemakers. Whereas just war doesn't really do that work of forming us as courageous, nonviolent peacemakers, which of course is really critical for any application of a last resort criteria. Because if you're gonna be able to recognize if you're actually at last resort, you need to have a pretty expansive imagination of what the nonviolent options might be in difficult situations. Third, just peace is consistent with ecological care, whereas just war has a tendency to enable practices that may be more destructive of our common home. And then the last two, just peace may do a better job at preventing and limiting war when it breaks out. And this is one of the really good intentions of just war theory, was in part to try to prevent and limit war. But what we've seen throughout history is the way this has been used, particularly by political leaders, is that it's mostly functioned, regardless of the intention, it's mostly functioned politically to justify wars. And then lastly, just peace has a better potential for breaking cycles of violence. So even when there are those situations where wars may appear to be just, it still seems that we regularly get stuck in these cycles or these dynamics of violence that carry on after the war in various types of trauma, civil wars, corruption, and so forth. And you can sort of see that from World War I to World War II, but also how World War II led to the Cold War, a number of proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, eventually Afghanistan, and so forth. So last part, how might a just peace framework impact military institutions? So notably, the U.S. Army has an insurgencies and counterinsurgencies manual, and it actually provides an example of how the seeds of some just peace norms are already present and perhaps ripe for further development. For example, they use the term generational engagement and relations between the population and government to identify how peace building, or the norms, just peace norms, of relationality and dialogue can be actualized, they say, at all stages of conflict, even high-threat situations. They also explicitly point to the norm of participation regarding youth and civil society. The manual also identifies the norm of sustainability and attains somewhat to root causes as they discuss economic development plans, as well as the importance of generating defections. So building off this existing reality in the military, an explicit just peace moral framework might also draw the military community to increasingly speak out and directly promote growing investment, resources, and strategic commitments to nonviolent approaches. It's often said that the military community is the most reluctant to engage war, so this ethic perhaps may better enable such tendencies. In the area of strategic doctrine, the just peace framework could draw the military community to shift somewhat core strategic orientations. That is to include, number one, engaging conflict constructively, two, breaking cycles of violence, And 3, cultivating a sustainable peace. So for example, engaging conflict constructively orients the military to fully identify root causes and key needs of all actors, as well as engage in intersectional analysis of conflicts. A focus on breaking cycles of violence orients the military to rehumanize adversaries, transform conflicts more than dominate another, better acknowledge responsibility for harm done, seek to turn adversaries into future partners more than outcompete them, and increasingly commit to reflexivity, that is, using means consistent with the ends. Such reflexivity is crucial to considering how to contribute rather than obstruct the conditions for sustainable peace. So rather than mere stability, the shift to a lens of sustainable peace might orient the military to not obstruct environmental and structural justice, to perhaps step back and enable space for civil society actors, and perhaps to make clear commitments toward one day outlawing and perhaps ending war itself, not simply trying to avoid crimes during war. Further, this moral framework would enable the military to better, perhaps, imagine new pilot programs. So, for example, drawing on the commitments to protection, this ethic could invite a pilot program on unarmed protection. This proven practice of unarmed civilian protection by organizations like the Nonviolent Peace Force can serve as models and resources for such a pilot. For example, in South Sudan, Nonviolent Peace Force's protection unit directly saved 14 people from an armed militia attack. This attack was occurring in a UN protection site. As people were running and being shot, 14 women and children rushed into a mud hut with 2 NP officers. 3 different times, the armed militia came in demanding that the NP officers leave, but each time they refused, saying they were unarmed, nonpartisan, humanitarian. Amazingly, the 14 women and children survived the deadly attack, while others were shot outside. One of the NP officers said, quote, "If we had a gun, we would have been shot immediately. So without arms, we can find other ways." Also, the UN is increasingly endorsing this methodology in formal documents, even at the UN Security Council, and the US government already provides some funding to Nonviolent Peace Force in South Sudan, for example. Another pilot program could be nonviolent civilian-based defense, as some other countries have done. The US military could become an expert and help train other militaries. Nonviolent civilian-based defense entails using nonviolent resistance to defend against military invasion, occupation, or coups. More, if not most people in some way can participate in this kind of resistance, taking more responsibility for their defense rather than simply delegating it to an elite group. This primarily entails strategic non-cooperation with orders from the adversary across various sectors of society, at times creating parallel institutions or government, to the point of making it significantly inconvenient to nearly impossible for the occupying force to benefit or even stay in power. So this has taken different forms. It's been developed a number of times in the past centuries. Some governments have recently incorporated it into their defense planning. Past examples include Czechoslovakian resistance against the Soviet occupation in 1968, the Philippines in 1986, the Baltic countries in 1990 to 91, the Russians preventing a Soviet coup in 91. Countries like Sweden, Austria, Switzerland, and Lithuania have incorporated civilian-based defense into their defense planning by providing research and development funds to create nonviolent methods to prevent military occupation. Last thought. However, it seems that shifting overall military strategy and structural programs can only go so far unless formation is also enhanced. One of the key challenges in military training is the desensitization, or at times dehumanization, of adversaries in order to increase the willingness of soldiers to kill. Yet, such dehumanization of others also can contribute to the dehumanization of the soldiers, such as through displacement of responsibility or decreasing empathy. The just peace norm of rehumanization, as well as the norm of dignity and rights, would challenge this strategy or ethos to dehumanize others. It might also supplement this formation with other virtues like compassion, humility, and empathy. In turn, a just peace ethic perhaps can cultivate healthier and less harmful action choices, or tactics by persons in the military, even when they operate in violent conflict zones. So there's a lot more nuance to explore here, but these are some initial lines of inquiry just for our discussion. Peace be with you.
Thank you. So I'm really grateful that you helped explain the connection about the importance of relationships, and I thought the insight of even the relationship with self is important for us to think about as we're bridging these concepts together. And because relationships are so important, we want to invite you to share maybe some of your questions or reactions or insights that you have based on hearing quite a bit of interesting concepts. Yeah. So.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody, for your comments and your thoughts. I have an observation more than a question, and it's an unabashed plug for the rest of the project next year. So one of the sessions we have next year is being led by Diana Putnam, who's USAID, right, I think, yeah. And her premise, or her session, is Women and Conflict Transformation. And her premise is that any peace where women have been involved or are involved has been stronger and has lasted longer.
Yes.
So if you have any thoughts on that, that'd be great. But I just wanted to mention that. So that's coming next year for everybody.
Yeah. We are always taught in the military, if you go into a strange situation, get the women involved to do the healing and work with them well with deep respect. That way you're not considered a threat to the culture. Stay away from the children, because the children will tell anybody anything, and so you could get in real trouble there. So work with exactly what you're saying. It's the women that are in the culture. The question you're asking, though, almost is, do we have to have women to engage women? And it helps because there is an automatic bond there that works, but I'm not sure exactly how many or how thorough and things like that. And it's a good question. And it's especially useful in our MP units, who are male and female, and it would be especially useful in things like special forces that you've seen on TVs and stuff, where women can do some things that men cannot do, men can do some things that women cannot do, and the complementarity makes them more effective in doing these good things. So yes, absolutely. Other questions?
Hello, and thank you for your time. I just wanted to ask a question specifically relating to how people come to the peace process itself. Generally, like, for example, in Northern Ireland, people only are able to...
A little bit louder, clearer, please.
Northern Ireland, for example, people are only able to discuss peace once their incentive to wage war has kind of decreased to a point that peace is a more beneficial situation. How do you achieve that balance faster than examples have been in the past?
I'll discuss Northern Ireland because I've been with some of the folks that are involved there. One of the basic issues is basic justice. Northern Ireland is 6 counties. They were deliberately pulled away from Southern Ireland in the 1919 when it was formed, not just because there's a Protestant group there and the rest of the place was Catholic. The designers of this felt they needed 6 counties to be able to be viable. Problem is, half of those 6 counties are Catholic. Okay, so you've got a huge Catholic and Protestant population in there that has been warring about it. Why? Because Catholics are not allowed to purchase land in Northern Ireland. Now that doesn't sound like much, but if you've got a business, you can't purchase this piece of property that's there to run your business, then you're at the mercy of everyone else who owns it. So until that basic justice is healed, there's still going to be some conflicts. Second issue is the forgiveness issue, because if you've had people that have been gunned down by one side or the other, and there's been atrocities on both sides, it takes a deliberate act of forgiveness. And we had that for a while. I think it was the Easter Agreement or something that worked pretty well. And because the people that were involved in that were not brought to legal accountability, it's in a limbo. In the one in Bougainville, there was an amnesty given, and everyone accepted that because it came from a higher authority that actually had the authority at the time. They were still part of Papua New Guinea. And so that authorization gave people permission to forgive. That hasn't happened in Northern Ireland. So until you get some of those basic issues there, I mean, the people really don't want to fight against each other. They'd rather drink together or argue about soccer teams or whatever they call them, or rugby, whichever happens. And they'd love to play together, and the kids do. The problem is there's some basic injustice things that haven't been settled, and they keep raising their ugly head until the justice is happening. So that's part of the answer for Northern Ireland. There are other issues parallel to that in terms of what you said about restorative justice. Things like centuries of slavery. What kind of restorative justice is there? Is affirmative action sufficient or is it not? How do you judge some of that? And what organization has the authority to make that judgment and then impose that judgment? Because there's always going to be someone that's going to disagree with the judgment. How do you impose it legitimately in good ways? So those are some of the struggles that we do not have the solution to yet, but it's an incentive to keep working at it. So, does that answer your questions?
I could offer some comments on both the question of gender and as well as incentives, maybe from some of a different perspective.
Sure.
One of course, the question of gender is one that is exploding in the field of peacekeeping and peace building. And on this question, in this field, there are what is sometimes referred to as different generations of thought on it. One generation of thought very much emphasizes the inclusion of women. So it sounds like along the lines of what might be what we're describing here of if we have a peace process that includes women, it will be more effective, right? Well, this is,
yes.
There are statistics that bear this out, mm-hmm. right? There would be another generation of thought that would say, well, yes, and perhaps it's not enough. Sometimes this first generation sometimes is the way of a shorthand for talking about that. Sometimes is it enough just to add women and stir? Is that enough? And so the second generation would want to look at this. And I don't know if when Eli talks about intersectionality in his reference, in his talk, if he was referring to this, but some approaches that think about intersectionality would want to look at, well, let's look at the intersections of gender and race and class, right? And looking at, so if you just picture an intersection of a road, right? Those people that are at the intersection of gender minority, racialized minority, and class minority, if you're in the center, you're going to be the most vulnerable. And when you get hit by a car that comes through the intersection, you're not going to know from which direction it came, but you're going to know that you're hit. You're going to be flat smashed on the ground, right? So an intersectional perspective might also be looking at, well, were there not just women that were involved in the negotiating table, let's say in Colombia? It was very important that women were involved in the negotiations, no doubt about it, on an elite level. But an intersectional perspective would also be thinking about, okay, do we have women who were involved and gender minorities, let's say, that are also involved in thinking about land redistribution? So that's thinking about the class issue. And are they coming from historically marginalized populations like Black Colombians? So in one way in which this is taken into consideration in the peace agreement is that just several weeks ago, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, just signed an agreement with Fedalco, which is the cattle cattle owners group. They're going to buy 30 million acres of land. That's amazing. The government of Colombia is going to buy this land back from those who are controlling a lot of it with the idea of redistributing it. And according to the peace agreement, that has to be done with and through women so that women become the holders of this land. So that is to say, it's taking that question of gender inclusion to a different level that looks at some of the root causes of violence, which is the unequal distribution of land and issues of economic justice, right? So this is just to speak a little bit about how some of these questions, how I'm seeing them unfold, both in the literature and then in the field when we're thinking about peace building and prevention and breaking cycles of violence, and then building the conditions of peace. And to this question about incentives, something that was important for me to see in Colombia, and I hope that it was conveyed in somewhat of what I was saying too, was that there were decades in which the government there was some participation in different kinds of negotiations, but there was going to be times when a state doesn't actually think that it's in its best interest to wage peace, right? Because waging war is actually really profitable for a lot of people and a lot of companies. So, but there are people who are deeply affected by situations of conflict and war. They're already going to be doing the work. They're already trying to transform that which is killing them, right? So how do we recognize and how do we come alongside and become allies with those groups, even when it's not in the interest of what we understand to be the power brokers to do just that? Which is it's a different kind of way of getting at this question of incentive. So how do we make it? How do we support those who are most affected, even when it's not in the interest of the big power brokers?
Thank you.
What worked for me in the National Guard, and this is just a little humorous anecdote, if I had some of my soldiers that were misbehaving, and I tried to get them to behave better, I'd speak to their conscience if that didn't work. I could threaten them with eternal damnation if that didn't work. But then I'd say, do you really want me to tell your grandmother what you're doing? And then you watch all the blood drain from their face. Those things did work because the Guard was a family kind of thing, and we knew each other's grandparents, and we could threaten them with that. And they straightened up wonderfully and well.
And I think this is actually a critical point to the gender question, because part of the issue is that there can be a cultural ethos, which is sometimes described as toxic masculinity. And if we dig deeper down, the more we can transform that, whether it's more women or whoever is involved in this, it's the toxic masculinity which is one of the contributors not only to violence but atrocities and war, right? So this is that sort of ethos that we have to be tough, we can only really feel aggression, we have to be ready and willing to dominate, versus the possibility of also being vulnerable, possibility of being compassionate or empathetic. So when you tell this story of like, well, how would your grandma think of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of that invitation into something more than just this toxic kind of masculinity. So I think that's another piece of the gender question.
Unless you
And
had
to
a
the
really
question of
violent grandmother or something.
And into the possibilities, and so Mark touched on on this interest in on the level of the self. One of the most interesting taxi rides I had in Colombia was when this was in 2017, so after the signing of the peace agreement. Someone picked me up at the airport in northern Colombia, and they were taking me to have conversations with some communities that were still in areas that were still affected by violence, because violence doesn't end after you sign a peace agreement,
Right.
unfortunately, right? So he's taking this, so the taxi driver picks me up, and I don't know who he is. He's been sent by the organization that I'm working with here. And he talks to me about how he was a soldier, he was a Colombian soldier, and how he loves working as a taxi driver now for this organization because he's learning so much about the person that he wants to become. He talks about how I was trained to be, he called a stone face, to have una cara de piedra. And so and you had to have a body that was sculpted in stone. And he's talked about how, so even when he was in civilian clothing, and he was on a bus, he was always very afraid that someone from the guerrilla, the warring army, would get on the bus, because if they would see him, they would know right away who he was, because he was shaped to be this stone face, right? But he's like, but a part of what he loved at working with this organization is that it's helping me to imagine the person that I want to become. And I just found that to be kind of a remarkable statement of the kind of internal and personal work that people are doing, even while the whole government was in transition to going from war to peace. The kind of remarkable work that this person, to your point, Eli, was himself trying to undergo.
We have time for about 2 more questions from the audience.
You know, the word respect was used, and, it's a pretty important word in your work. But I hate to say it like this, but I loved
It's on, just hold it closer.
when they showed the bodies from the people that were killed in the church, they obstructed their faces out of respect for them, as respect for the dead. And also the women had a big role in the film and a big role in the piece. And it maybe worked because they incorporated the Maori culture. So I was very impressed with that too.
They had to have an honest broker that was able to be seen as someone that both sides could begin to trust. That catalyst was necessary to take the desire for nonviolence into the effect of a peace. You had to have a catalyst to be willing to do that. And New Zealand was willing to do it at risk of going in without weapons. And at risk of bringing them there, respecting the cultures and all the other pieces. It was a long process. There were several moving parts, we'd say. And all the parts were willing to do that. But that was the catalyst to get the desire on the ground actually into working together. Sure.
So this question, I guess, is focused mainly on what you said, Dr. Eli, about building and developing nonviolent cultures, and I guess also as well to the rest of the panel. But in terms of conflict that we have seen in Afghanistan, how that turned out, just objectively speaking, I would say that it didn't really seem like we won that war. Just objectively speaking from my opinion. But at the beginning of that war, it was mainly focused because of what what happened 9/11 and getting revenge, I guess. But over the course of the war, it seemed like it developed more into nation building and trying to work with the cultures to create a nonviolent culture. But at least from my understanding, it seems like with the religion in that area, they both believe relatively the same thing, but one believes in the actual full implementation of their religious law in the culture of the society, whereas the other does not. And so when it comes to nonviolent cultures and creating the nonviolent cultures, what would it look like in a situation like that when to try and create a nonviolent culture, you're sort of going against what their culture is saying in the first place?
Yeah. I'll speak to that because I had a buddy that served in Afghanistan a couple of times. I know all the people that are kind of involved. I interviewed the imams and stuff. To build a nonviolent culture in a society that, number one, is tribal rather than equally participatory. Tribal is structured, and to try and say we're going to take you from a tribal culture into something else that you don't want to go into is actually a cultural imposition rather than a cultural enhancement. And there's still struggles there. Little girls are not allowed to be educated. Even before the Taliban took over, there were some places they were not. One tribe would oppress others, or one group would not give others the same kinds of protection and stuff. That was an issue. The Taliban are an extreme, strong Islamic perspective, but that's not the real deep issue. It's whether or not you can have a tribal culture that had a king that people respected, because the tribes respected the king. Once the monarchy was gone, and when the last royal member that Karzai used to confer with daily had died, things disappeared. To try and transform a tribal culture into a democratic one is, in a sense, a cultural imposition. You may say you could begin to foster human rights within that culture, but to try and impose a different culture is shall we say, is in the too hard to do box, we would put. And in some ways, I would also have to say, morally speaking, is in a wrong to do box. What right do we have to say that everyone else has to be a democracy? I mean, that's a question I got to raise, because there's nothing in any of our religious perspectives that says that. It's a political perspective that worked beautifully from the beginning of the American culture to the present day, but that doesn't mean it's automatically going to work for everybody else. And that's hard for us to see, because it works so well for us. We think everybody has to be just like us, and that's not a fair assessment, but it's hard to get out of that assessment.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a few things. Number one, I think the norm or the idea of participatory processes is really critical here, right? Like, particularly if there's folks from outside of that culture trying to do something constructive, like, it's got to be a process where the voices of the different groups or the different leaders have mechanisms to participate in, like, what is it that we want to become? Like, what are our next steps, right? That's a critical piece. The other piece that I think is important is this practice or norm of, like, acknowledging harm. And that can be modeled by, in this case, people from the US. We can acknowledge some of the harm that we participated in as a way to invite similar moments of people in Afghanistan, whether it's different groups, engaging that practice of acknowledging harm. And the more that's done, whether it's like one-on-one or between communities or at the political level, you start to create conditions and space where people are willing to maybe trust the other side and maybe start to envision, what a better culture might look like. Afghanistan actually has some pretty profound, indigenous practices of trauma healing and restoration that they've used, and they could, get more attention and get scaled up. There's a book called The Nonviolent Soldier of Islam. It's this guy named Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Khan, and he lived during Gandhi's time in the area which is the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan now, but he was part of this Pashtun tribe, which is, I think, pretty similar to the Taliban. And they had this culture of retributive violence. If anybody disrespects you, you come back at them,
right,
in a violent way, whether it's put downs or shooting people. And he was able to draw on his Islamic kind of heritage and communicate to them that they can use that same courage, that same anger, that same hostility at injustice to, in this case, resist the British occupation through nonviolent resistance. And they created the first nonviolent peace army that we kind of know of, 800,000 people at one point, right? Or 100,000 people at one point. So that's part of that culture too. And we actually met with some people in Afghanistan who were asking this kind of question, and they were starting to talk about Khan and how they could bring back sort of Khan's credibility within that space as a model for how they can move in the direction of a nonviolent culture. And that's kind of the critical thing, is how do you start moving in that direction? It's not like all violence is just going to stop, but what are the steps to kind of move down that road?
That doesn't always work, though. After World War I, the Turks wiped out 9 million Armenians who were nonviolent. So you have to have someone like the British that doesn't want to wipe out 100,000 or something to have it work.
Well, I mean, that's not
disagree.
actually accurate. I mean, there's been a lot of cases where hostile authoritarian dictators have lost power, not because they didn't want to hurt the nonviolent activists, but because their sources of power were diminished. So it's not dependent on the sort of kindness or the democratic ethos of the adversary for nonviolence to succeed.
I would disagree.
I can see where this debate will occur again. We can continue this tomorrow with the second part of the session at the Cumberland County Historical Society beginning at 7 p.m. But I'd like to offer the moderator to offer any closing comments.
Yeah, just a big thank you to our panelists, to Jana, to Eli, and to Father Dolan, to you, the participants who listened and reflected and shared to develop that relationship and help us to consider the importance of just war and just peace and some nuances that we all need to be thinking about. I'd like to end with a quote from Archbishop Timothy Broglio, who's the Archbishop for the Military Services. He had a statement that he issued on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, which references the sacrifices of all brave servicemen and women. But I think with Jana's explanation about the sacrifice of those who also seek peace, we could include them in this statement too. And the Archbishop said that we ask God that their sacrifice not be in vain. We beg him to transform our power, to turn war into a force for peace, to transform our weapons into plowshares, to give us the ability to negotiate, to talk, and to listen. We pray to remain vigilant against the forces of evil in our troubled world, and to pour our energies into building lasting peace and justice among nations. So thank you for being here, and have a good night all.
Yeah, I would like to, if we could show a round of applause for our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much. I'd like to offer a few comments before we conclude. One is this is invaluable, and it's clear that this is a dialogue that institutions need to have at the highest level. Just war tradition, whether it's permissive or restrictive, should it be dismissed? Should we evolve into just peace, or could there be some type of bridge built for a better understanding in transforming conflict? In my 30-year career, I tend to shun away when people are asked what's the purpose of the armed forces, and the usual response is to win the nation's wars and battles. I subscribe to a different perspective on the function of the armed forces. To me, it should be the reduction of the adversary's will. And that's a very different perspective, because along the force continuum, beginning with negotiation and dialogue to strategic weapons, perhaps nuclear, we tend, when we intervene into conflicts, we tend to jump into the middle of the force continuum, using force and violence to transform conflict. And we see that is having marginal utility at best. So we're applying force in many of these interventions, but it's not having utility. It's not moving toward peace with justice. So I think this is the beginning of a dialogue in our project, and I thank everyone for bringing these topics to the forefront, because they need to be discussed. And one last thing, and I'm going to pay more attention to the film tomorrow. It's the first time I've seen excerpts from it. But what grabbed me was, one, heroes are the people on the ground and building that peace. But one in particular who wears the uniform, Brigadier General Morlock. Mm-hmm. And I was impressed the fact that he was a Vietnam veteran, saw the failure of the use of force, was in a UN peacekeeping operation that I think went awry. I don't know enough about the background of that particular one. But he also came to the realization that there are other ways to solve conflict. And I admire the risk he took, because we have a responsibility to, when we deploy and employ our young men and women, we are to minimize the risk to those individuals. So, but I admire him. I think a way to look at perhaps bringing these to integrate the discussion of just peace into military institutions would be perhaps a case study approach, where leaders like Brigadier General Morlock can bring in his experiences and others throughout history. So I think that's could be a very strong way of opening our eyes to see how to transform conflict in different ways, instead of using force and violence. Anyway, I'm looking forward to part 2 tomorrow. And I know it'll be very similar to this, but you've given me incredible insights, and so I value everything that was said tonight. And I ask everybody to join us in the future and come back again tomorrow night. Again, we're going to take a little hiatus over Thanksgiving holiday and the Christmas holiday, and return again with new and upcoming venues that again address the nature and consequences of war, and war's impact on our society, specifically our veterans and their families, but also communities writ large. So again, thank you for everybody attending. You can follow us on www.warpeacejustice.org for upcoming events. And we will also be publishing this video of tonight's session on our YouTube site, on our website. And so again, thank you, and have a safe journey home tonight. Thank you very much.